My name is Callie Carter, and I am 28 years old. For most of my life, I believed that the bond of family was an unbreakable tether, something that would hold fast regardless of the storms we encountered or the differences in our bank accounts. I was the quiet middle child, the one who worked as a restorative architectural consultant, a job that meant I spent most of my days covered in limestone dust and wood shavings, restoring historical landmarks that most people simply walk past without a second glance. My sister, Elena, was the polar opposite. She was the golden child, a woman who treated life like a perpetual runway and viewed people as rungs on a ladder. When she announced her engagement to Julian Sterling, the heir to the Sterling shipping empire, my parents reacted as if they had just been granted keys to a kingdom. They didn't just celebrate her happiness. They began a systematic process of shedding anything they deemed beneath their new social aspiration. Unfortunately, that included me. The realization didn't hit all at once. It started with small comments during Sunday dinners, which I still made an effort to attend despite my grueling schedule. My mother would look at my calloused hands and sigh, wondering aloud why I couldn't have chosen a more dainty profession like gallery curation or interior design. My father would talk incessantly about Julian's golf handicap and the exclusive clubs he was being invited to join. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was 3 weeks before Christmas, the one time of year our family always spent together at our cabin in the mountains. My mother's voice was uncharacteristically stiff when she told me that they had decided to host a very private, very formal Christmas Eve dinner for the Sterling family. She didn't lead with the rejection. She led with the logistics of their prestige. She explained that Julian's parents, Alistair and Beatrice Sterling, were old money, the kind of people who could trace their lineage back to the founding of the city and whose names were etched into the brass plaques of every major museum. I listened as she described the caterers they had hired and the dress code they had established. I waited for my invitation, for the part where she told me what time to arrive. Instead, there was a long, suffocating pause. Then she said it. She told me that they had decided it would be better if I didn't attend this year. She said that my presence might be a bit too jarring for people of the Sterling's caliber. When I asked her what that meant, she didn't hold back. She told me that I was too unrefined, that my lifestyle was too blue-collar, and that I lacked the social grace to navigate a room full of elites. She said she didn't want to spend the entire night worrying if I would say the wrong thing or if I would show up with dirt under my fingernails. My own mother told me that I would end up humiliating them in front of the people who now held the keys to their future social standing. I was stunned. I had spent my entire adult life being the reliable daughter. I was the one who helped them pay off their mortgage when my father's business hit a slump 5 years ago. I was the one who took care of the house when my mother had her gallbladder surgery. But none of that mattered now. Elena had secured a millionaire, and in their eyes, I had become a liability. Elena even called me later that night, not to apologize, but to reinforce the boundary. She told me that this was the most important night of her life and that she couldn't risk anything going wrong. She said that the Sterlings were elite and that I just wouldn't fit in. She suggested I take a solo trip somewhere or just stay in my apartment and order takeout. She spoke to me as if I were a distant, slightly embarrassing acquaintance rather than her own sister. The weeks leading up to Christmas were the loneliest I had ever experienced. I watched through social media as my family posted photos of the preparations. They bought new furniture, hired a professional decorator to transform the cabin into a winter wonderland, and spent thousands on outfits that screamed old-world elegance. I stayed in my workshop, throwing myself into my latest project. I was currently working on the restoration of the Grand Library's vaulted ceilings, a project funded by a mysterious, high-profile donor who went by a corporate pseudonym. It was exhausting work, but it was the only thing that kept me from spiraling into a deep depression. I felt like I had been erased from my own history. On December 23rd, I realized I had left a box of my professional portfolios and some personal mementos at the cabin during my last visit in the fall. I knew my family would already be there, sequestered away in their elitist bubble. But I needed those documents for a meeting on the 26th. I decided to drive up late at night, hoping to slip in, grab my things from the mudroom, and leave without causing a scene. I didn't want to see them, and I certainly didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. The drive was long and snowy, the winding mountain roads reflecting my own turbulent thoughts. I reached the cabin around midnight, seeing the warm glow of the lights through the frost-covered windows. It looked like a postcard, a scene of domestic perfection that I was no longer a part of. I used my spare key to enter through the side door. The house smelled of expensive pine and cinnamon. As I moved toward the mudroom, I couldn't help but peek into the living room. It was unrecognizable. My parents had replaced our cozy, lived-in furniture with sleek, velvet pieces. On the mantel, amidst the expensive garland, stood several framed photos. They were mostly of Elena and Julian, looking radiant and wealthy. But in the corner, tucked behind a large vase of lilies, was an old photo of me. It was a professional shot taken 2 years ago, when I had been awarded the National Heritage Prize for my work on the state capitol. I was wearing my work gear, standing on a scaffold, covered in dust but smiling with a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. I assumed they had forgotten to hide it. Or perhaps it was tucked away so far back that they thought no one would notice. I grabbed my box of portfolios, but as I turned to leave, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was my mother and Elena. They were laughing about the seating chart. My mother mentioned how relieved she was that they didn't have to explain me to Beatrice Sterling. Elena laughed and said that Beatrice would probably think I was part of the catering staff if I had shown up. The cruelty of their words stung more than the cold wind outside. I didn't wait to hear more. I hurried out to my truck, my heart heavy, and drove back to the city. I spent Christmas Eve alone in my apartment, eating a frozen dinner and watching the snow fall over the skyline. I felt small, discarded, and utterly alone. What they didn't know, and what I hadn't bothered to tell them because they never asked about my work in detail, was the identity of the family who owned the grand library I was restoring. I only knew them through their lawyers and their foundation directors. I knew they were powerful, and I knew they were exacting, but I had never met the principals in person. I was just the expert they hired to save their legacy. The next morning, Christmas Day, my phone exploded with notifications. I ignored them at first, thinking it was just automated holiday greetings. But then I saw a string of frantic texts from my mother. They were incoherent at first, just a series of exclamation points and demands that I pick up the phone. Then came a text from Elena. "Callie, what did you do? Why are they asking for you? Why are they screaming?" I was confused. I hadn't done anything. I was sitting in my pajamas drinking lukewarm coffee. Finally, I answered a call from my father. His voice was trembling. He told me that the Sterlings had arrived for the Christmas morning brunch. Everything had been going perfectly. They were sipping mimosas and discussing the upcoming wedding. But then, Alistair Sterling had walked over to the mantel to admire the decorations. He had moved the vase of lilies to get a better look at a small antique clock my father was showing off, and he had seen the photo of me on the scaffold. According to my father, Alistair had frozen. He had picked up the frame, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had called Beatrice over, and she had let out a literal scream of recognition. They weren't screams of horror or disgust, as my family had feared. They were screams of shock and reverence. They started demanding to know where I was. They started asking why the most talented architectural conservator in the country, the woman they had spent millions to hire for their private estate restoration, was not present at her own family's Christmas. They weren't just Julian's parents. They were my primary clients. They were the anonymous donors behind the Grand Library project, and I was the person they credited with saving their family's ancestral history. My father's voice was a mix of terror and confusion as he begged me to come to the cabin immediately. He said the Sterlings refused to sit down for brunch until I was there. He said that Alistair was offended that I hadn't been mentioned in the family introductions. The very people my parents thought I would humiliate them in front of were currently treating my absence as a personal insult to their guest of honor. I sat there for a moment, the irony of the situation washing over me like a cold wave. They wanted me there now because I was an asset. They wanted me there because I was famous in the only circle that mattered to them. I didn't rush. I took my time getting dressed. I didn't put on a gown or a designer suit. I put on a pair of high-quality dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and my best leather boots. I looked like exactly who I was, a professional, a specialist, and a woman who didn't need their approval to be elite. As I drove back up the mountain, I realized that the power dynamic had shifted entirely. My family had tried to bury me to impress the Sterlings, not realizing that I was the very reason the Sterlings would ever respect our family name in the first place. I pulled into the driveway and saw my father waiting by the door, his face pale, looking like a man who had just realized he had thrown away a winning lottery ticket. I walked into that cabin not as the embarrassing middle child, but as the woman the Sterlings had been trying to secure a private meeting with for months. The silence that fell over the room when I entered was deafening. My mother and Elena stood in the corner, looking small and frantic. But Alistair and Beatrice Sterling, they dropped their glasses and rushed toward me as if I were royalty. Alistair Sterling did not just greet me. He stepped forward with a level of genuine enthusiasm that I had never seen him display in the few formal Zoom calls we had shared with his legal team. He took my hand in both of his, shaking it with a vigor that made my mother's mouth drop open in a perfecto of shock. He told Beatrice to really look at me, and she did, her eyes scanning my face with a mixture of awe and delight. She exclaimed that they had been trying to get me to commit to a private dinner for months to discuss the West Wing restoration of their estate in the Berkshires. But my office had kept telling them I was far too busy with the Grand Library project. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes, and said she had no idea that the brilliant Callie Carter they were essentially stalking for her expertise was the same Callie Carter who belonged to this family. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a stone saw. My mother tried to step forward, her face a mask of panicked social engineering. She attempted to laugh along, saying something about how I was always so modest about my little hobby. But Alistair cut her off without even looking at her. He corrected her firmly, stating that what I did was not a hobby, but a masterclass in preservation that very few people in the world were capable of executing. He turned back to me, ignoring the rest of the room entirely, and asked why I wasn't there when they arrived. He mentioned that when they saw the photo on the mantel, they assumed I was just running late. But as the morning progressed and my name wasn't mentioned, they began to worry I was ill. I looked past Alistair and made direct eye contact with Elena. She looked physically ill. The millionaire heir she had landed, Julian, was looking at me with a newfound curiosity, clearly surprised that his future sister-in-law was someone his father spoke of with such reverence. I decided then that I wasn't going to make this easy for them. I didn't yell, and I didn't cause the scene my mother had been so afraid of. Instead, I used the calm, professional tone I used when explaining structural failures to city boards. I told Alistair that there had been a bit of a misunderstanding regarding the guest list. I explained that my parents and Elena felt that my presence might be a bit too informal for such an elite gathering, and that it was suggested I spend the holiday elsewhere to avoid any potential embarrassment. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the color drain from my father's face. Alistair's expression shifted from warmth to a cold, hard steel that made even me feel a bit intimidated. He turned slowly to look at my father, his eyebrows raised in a way that signaled a very dangerous shift in the atmosphere. He asked, quite pointedly, if he had heard me correctly. He asked my father if he truly believed that a woman of my professional standing and international reputation could ever be an embarrassment to a mountain cabin in the woods. Beatrice didn't even wait for an answer. She stepped toward Elena and asked her, with a voice as sharp as a diamond, if she was the one who felt her sister wasn't elite enough to sit at the same table as the Sterlings. Elena began to stammer, her hands shaking as she tried to adjust her designer dress. She tried to claim it was all a big joke, a sisterly prank that had gone too far. But Beatrice wasn't having it. Beatrice had spent her life navigating the highest echelons of society, and she could smell a social climber's desperation from a mile away. She told Eleanor that the most unfashionable thing a person could be was ungrateful and cruel to their own blood, especially when that blood was the only person in the room with a real, tangible legacy. The irony was delicious. My family had spent months trying to mold themselves into what they thought the Sterlings wanted: polished, shallow, and exclusionary, only to find out that the Sterlings valued the very thing my family had tried to hide: hard work, specialized knowledge, and authenticity. For the next hour, the power dynamic in the house was completely inverted. Alistair insisted that I sit at the head of the table next to him. My father was forced to move to a side chair, and my mother was relegated to the far end, where she sat in a stunned, silent stupor. Julian tried to engage me in conversation about the shipping industry, but Alistair kept steering the conversation back to my work. He wanted to know about the humidity sensors I had installed in the Grand Library and my thoughts on the ethical implications of using synthetic resins in 18th century masonry. I spoke with confidence, knowing that I was the only person in the room who actually knew what they were talking about. My family, who had treated me like a ghost for years, were now forced to sit and listen to me be the center of the universe. I could see the gears turning in my mother's head. She was trying to figure out how to pivot, how to take credit for my success, or how to spin this so she could still claim I was her darling, successful daughter. She tried to chime in, mentioning how they had always supported my education, but Alistair didn't let her finish. He remarked that it was interesting they supported my education, but didn't seem to value the results of it enough to invite me to Christmas. He was being brutal, and a part of me felt a twinge of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of how I felt sitting alone in my apartment the night before, eating a frozen meal while they laughed at the idea of me being mistaken for the help. Elena was the most miserable of all. This was supposed to be her day. This was the day she was supposed to solidify her place in the Sterling family. Instead, she was being ignored by her future in-laws, who were far more interested in my stories about climbing scaffolding in rainstorms than her stories about bridal boutiques in Paris. Julian seemed to be seeing her in a new light, too, and not a flattering one. He looked at her with a sense of disappointment, as if he realized that the woman he was marrying was far more shallow than he had previously believed. He even apologized to me privately when we went to the kitchen to get more coffee, saying he had no idea I had been excluded, and that he found the whole thing incredibly distasteful. As the afternoon wore on, the Sterlings made it clear that their interest in my family was strictly tied to me. Alistair told my father that he had been considering investing in my father's new real estate venture, but that he now had some serious reservations about the character of the man he would be partnering with. My father looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The very connection they had tried to protect by banning me was now crumbling because of my absence. It was a perfect, poetic reversal of fortune. My family had played a high-stakes game of social chess and had managed to checkmate themselves by sacrificing their most valuable piece. Before the sun began to set, Alistair stood up and announced that he and Beatrice would be leaving. This was a shock to everyone, as they were supposed to stay for the full Christmas dinner. Alistair looked at me and said that since I was the one they really wanted to spend time with, and since I clearly wasn't being treated with the respect I deserved here, they would like to invite me to join them at their own estate for the remainder of the holiday. He said they had a vintage bottle of Bordeaux they had been saving for a special occasion, and he couldn't think of a better reason to open it than to celebrate a new partnership with the best in the business. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were pleading with me to stay and fix this. I looked at Elena, who was on the verge of tears. Then I looked at the Sterlings, who were offering me the kind of genuine respect my own family had denied me. I didn't hesitate. I told them I would be honored to join them. I went to the mudroom, grabbed my box of portfolios, and walked toward the door. My mother tried to stop me, grabbing my arm and whispering that I couldn't leave, that I had to tell the Sterlings it was all a misunderstanding. I looked her in the eye and told her that she was right about one thing: someone in this family was a humiliation. But for the first time in my life, I knew it wasn't me. As I walked out to my truck, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The drive to the Sterling estate was a stark contrast to the drive up the mountain the night before. I wasn't the discarded daughter anymore. I was a woman of value who had finally found her place, even if that place was outside the family I had always tried so hard to please. But the story wasn't over yet. As we arrived at the Sterling Manor, Alistair turned to me with a look that suggested he had one more surprise up his sleeve, something that would ensure my family would never be able to look at me the same way again. The Sterling estate was a monument to timelessness, a sprawling stone manor that felt more like a fortress of history than a residence. As we walked through the grand foyer, Alistair and Beatrice treated me not as a guest or a contractor, but as a peer. The evening was a blur of high-level conversation, vintage wine, and a genuine warmth I had forgotten existed. But as the clock struck 9, Alistair led me into his private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and blueprints of the various landmarks his foundation had saved. He sat behind a heavy mahogany desk and looked at me with an expression that was both paternal and predatory in its business focus. He told me that he hadn't just invited me here for dinner. He told me that he had been watching my career for 5 years, ever since I had saved that crumbling cathedral in Brussels. He said that my family's behavior earlier that day hadn't just offended him. It had confirmed a theory he held about the industry. He believed that the greatest talents were often silenced by the people closest to them, because those people were too small to understand the scale of the work. Alistair then slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the desk. He told me that the Sterling Foundation was launching an international division for heritage preservation, and they wanted a chief executive consultant to head the entire operation. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a partnership. It came with a seat on the board, a salary that made my current earnings look like pocket change, and most importantly, the absolute power to choose which historical sites across the globe would live and which would die. He told me that he wanted the Carter name to be synonymous with the Sterling legacy, but specifically my version of the Carter name. I realized then that by choosing to value me over my family's shallow social climbing, Alistair was giving me the ultimate weapon of revenge, total independence, and a level of status my parents could never hope to achieve. No matter how many millionaire heirs Elena married, I accepted the position on the spot. The next morning, on December 26th, the news of my appointment was sent out in a formal press release from the Sterling Foundation. By noon, my phone was ringing incessantly. My mother was the first to call, her voice now dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my skin crawl. She didn't apologize for banning me. Instead, she tried to act as if my success was a shared family victory. She told me that she always knew I was destined for greatness, and that we should host a massive New Year's Eve party at the cabin to celebrate my new role. She even suggested that I could use my influence to help my father secure that investment he had lost after his behavior at brunch. I let her finish her entire monologue before I spoke. I told her that I was no longer interested in being the family's secret weapon or their safety net. I told her that if she wanted to see me, she could book an appointment through my executive assistant in the new year, but that I would be spending my holidays from now on with people who recognized my value before they saw my name on a press release. Then came Elena. She didn't call. She sent a series of desperate emails. Apparently, Julian's parents had been very vocal about their disappointment in her character. The wedding, which was supposed to be the social event of the decade, was now on shaky ground. Julian had told her that he couldn't marry someone who would treat her own sister like a second-class citizen just to impress his parents. She begged me to talk to Beatrice for her, to tell her that it was all a misunderstanding and that we were actually very close. She even tried to guilt-trip me, saying that my success would mean nothing if I destroyed her happiness. I replied with a single sentence. You told me I would humiliate the family, Elena. But it seems you've managed to do that all by yourself. I didn't reach out to the Sterlings on her behalf. I let the consequences of her own elitism play out exactly as they deserved. A week later, I was standing in the terminal of the airport, waiting for a flight to Rome to begin my first site assessment for the foundation. I saw my reflection in the glass. No limestone dust, no wood shavings, just a woman who had finally stepped out from the shadow of her family's expectations. I received a final text from my father. He told me that they had been forced to sell the mountain cabin because his business venture had completely collapsed without Alistair's backing. He asked if I could lend them some money to get back on their feet. I thought about the years I had spent being the reliable one, the one who paid their bills and fixed their problems, while they looked down on my calloused hands. I deleted the message without replying. As I boarded the plane, I felt a profound sense of peace. My family had tried to ban me from a holiday dinner because I wasn't elite enough, only to realize that I was the only thing giving them any proximity to the world they craved. They had lost their status, their connection to the Sterlings, and their relationship with me, all in the span of 48 hours. I settled into my seat in the first-class cabin, looking out at the clouds as we lifted off. I was Callie Carter. I was 28 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just part of a family story, I was the one writing it. The revenge wasn't in the money or the title. It was in the silence I left behind, a silence they would have to live with every Christmas for the rest of their lives. If you like this story, subscribe my channel, My Calm Revenge. Don't forget to hit the bell icon